Aloha, I'm Kimo Alama Keaulana, and I'm so glad that you're here to join me to chit-chat a bit about Kanikau. You, um, I have to say that there is no greater truth and power than love. Nothing greater. And that's what's in the Kanikau. There's no greater beauty than love. And Hawaiians knew how to express that very, very well. I never gave Kanikau much of a thought until about a little over 20 years ago when I got a phone call from the late Edith McKenzie, Auntie Edith. And she had asked me if I would like to work with Rubellite Kawena Johnson on a Kanikau project. And so she said that Kawena Johnson would gladly have me come because of what I knew with other kinds of mele. And I never knew much about Kanikau, so I said, I'm on board, let's do this. And so we met on Monday afternoons with Kumu Kawena Johnson and Kaipo Mahelona, who worked with her on the Inoa Hoku book and other things. And Noelani Arista, who is now Dr. Noelani Arista. And that was it, we just got together. And so Kaipo Mahelona got to concentrate and look at the Kanikau that were produced by Maka'ainana mostly. And then I was assigned to do the royal, the Ali'i Kanikau. And then Noelani did the Kanikau of notables and historical figures. We found out a lot about Kanikau just by us bringing ourselves together and our minds together. You know, after thinking about Kanikau, well, these past 20 years, what's in the Kanikau is how people thought and felt as Hawaiians, which has a lot to teach us in our age now, when we look at Kanikau from the 19th century. The attitudes of how people felt towards losing a loved one through death and how Hawaiians felt is very, very different from how we feel today. Today, when somebody dies, we have the tendency to have these celebrations of life. And I've been to hundreds of funerals. No, I'm not kidding. Hundreds of funerals. As a professional singer, I sang at hundreds of funerals. And seeing funerals throughout these past decades, it's changed a lot. Modern day Hawaiians tend to, like I say, have a celebration of life. Hawaiians didn't believe that in the 19th century. They believe that when you celebrate someone's life, you're going to celebrate their lives while they're alive. And those things are also in the Kanikau. And we'll get to that later. But the way Hawaiians felt grief, and they were not ashamed to grieve over the dead. They did it so elegantly and so appropriately. When someone's life ended, a part of your life ended as well. And to put these feelings into words are absolutely exquisite, as shown in the Kanikau. Now, the kinds of language used in the Kanikau, it kind of depended on whom the Kanikau is for. As my role, primarily looking through the royal Kanikau, we're going to see some Kanikau that were reworked from things that probably came from the ancient days, in the midst of time. We're going to look at words that did not exist, amongst commoners at least, or did not even show themselves up in any dictionary. Sometimes these words were compound words, some other words. So for the linguists and those sincerely interested in language, Kanikaus are rich. The Kanikau is very, very rich to decipher meaning. It's really mind-boggling to see how Hawaiians can describe like the sounds of silence, or what does silence feel like, and what happens to the soul on a silent journey, on the road that there is no return. And in the language are very, very many symbolisms. My auntie, some of you folks might know her, the late Lydia Namahana Mayoho up at the Royal Mausoleum, she told me something one time. She said there was a funeral pall, and she told me the colors on that funeral pall were blue, purple, a gray, and black, I think it was. And she told me that she often wondered what those colors were. Now, going to the Kanikau, we found out what those colors were. Those colors are the colors of death that appear in the evening sky after sunset. And this also tells us why Hawaiians wore certain colors at certain times. The Hawaiians of traditional Hawaiian time would never wear the colors of sunset, dusk. They would never wear black or purple or dark grays and dark blues and those kinds of colors, which signify the end of one's life. Those were colors worn appropriately when someone died. So while somebody is living, you're going to wear the colors that are found in daylight. So these are some of the nuances we find in Kanikau. And these symbolisms of color are also going to transfer towards not only the sky, but also towards plant. We're going to see certain plants recurring over and over sometimes in Kanikau. And it's because of the colors that they have in their flowers, or maybe in their fruits or their seeds. One of the things we're also going to find is ahihi in the Kanikau. And those of us who are familiar with the lehua ahihi, well, we know its color is red. And that's an instance where color has no play in the Kanikau symbolism. But what it is in a symbolism of the word. Ahihi, ahi-ahi, evening time. So it goes back to those kinds of attitudes Hawaiians have. And if you want to find out really about the attitudes of Hawaiians, you look into the Kanikau. Now, I was speaking earlier about the Royal Kanikau and use of language at one level. But as Hawaiians started to submit their Kanikau into the Hawaiian language newspapers, you're reaching a different audience. An audience of people who were interested and loved, Hawaiians loved mele. Oh, every Hawaiian language newspaper almost always had mele in it, because Hawaiians are lovers of poetry. What you're going to find, though, are these wonderful poetic expressions for a deceased person. That's going to be wonderful descriptive language about places and experiences, descriptions of places that we don't even know where these places are today. This is where the Hawaii State Archives comes into play. Now, at the time, over 20 years ago, when I worked on the Kanikau project that I described to you, we largely went into the Hawaiian language, exclusively into the Hawaiian language newspapers to extract Kanikau. And we also came across places. So we looked at the maps that were available to us. The place where we kind of overlooked was the Hawaii State Archives. And the Hawaii State Archives would help researchers in looking at places because of all the maps that's deposited there. And I have never taken the time, nor had the luxury of time, to go through the map holdings there. But I bet that if I had that time and went through the map collections, we would be able to locate places, names that we don't use anymore. And also, one of the things, especially in Royal Kanikaus, we have names that pop up sometimes, and we wonder, who are these people? Well, the genealogies can be found in the Genealogical Records at the Hawaii State Archives. One of the things that I've discovered at the Hawaii State Archives fairly recently are the holdings of manuscripts of people that left us some records of Kanikau in private collections, in their books. Now, Kanikau are heirlooms. Hawaiians always considered a mele an heirloom. That's why we have the haku mele, the composer, and the haku oke mele, the owner of a particular mele. The haku oke mele is one who is like the custodian of mele. Now, Hawaiians kept mele books, and in these books would be just an eclectic collection sometimes of mele. Inside some of these collections, in the archives, you're going to find Kanikau. And Hawaiians wrote these things down because they wanted to keep a permanent record for it. Now, this is not to say that Hawaiians wrote Kanikau, but I believe they did not. Hawaiians composed Kanikau. To me, writing a mele is actually taking an instrument onto paper and writing it down and erasing things when you want to change. But I believe that did not happen. The composing was done, first of all, in the heart, and then it went to the mind, and then and inscribed in the heart. And how they took on their written form was through ink and paper, and written, finally written into books, or written onto paper, and submitted to the Hawaiian language newspapers. In the Hawaii State Archives, I found that there are actually these copies of the original form, written on paper, that was submitted to the Hawaiian language newspapers. And so it would be an interesting thing to actually look at the original on paper in handwriting and then looking at the printed copy and to see if there were any differences and to reconcile those differences as a part of research and study. But getting back to the genealogies, the Hawaii State Archives has a wealth of genealogical records that we can decipher names and kind of put pieces of puzzles together, or answer questions that we often had. Who are these people? Or even in the Kanikau themselves, who is this person? We might be able to find it in the Hawaii State Archives. Because there are manuscript files. Theodore Kelsey, for example, he went to as many informants as he could during his lifetime, and he wrote down what they said. There's notes, a little bit of this and a little bit of that. But you know, when you take a little bit of this, a little bit of that, it adds up to quite a lot to further our understanding of what these Kanikau are trying to say. And Hawaiians grieved so gracefully. It was a total loss for them when somebody from their life went, whether it was a spouse, a child, a dear friend. I came across one, was a classmate, and these were just boys, but when you look at their use of Hawaiian, oh gosh, it was beautiful. Then there were Hawaiians from away who went to the continental United States for some reason, either the gold rush or something. And if somebody died up there, they would submit the Kanikau back home here. So we get glimpses of their life away. That's the value of Kanikau. It's not only the death aspect, but the life aspect. Celebrating one's life while you're still living. Kanikau, as Ruby Johnson termed it, she's called them songs for the soul. And that's what they were. It was from one person's living soul speaking to another soul. The approach and technique of composing Kanikau are different from, let's say, mele noa. A mele noa is for a living person. You have to watch out the kinds of words that you put into a mele noa. Hawaiians always lived by the olelo no eau, you know, where there in the word is life, in the word is death, ika olelo keola, ika olelo kamake. But for Kanikau, the person is already deceased. So the use of language is much wider and much more descriptive in many ways, because there's no limitations on the descriptions. The first Kanikau appears in 1834 in Kalama, Hawaii. And they're going to come into at least in the newspapers, until the 20th century, until about when Prince Kuhio passes away. It's a fascinating study of how people lived. And if we ever wanted to figure out what it is to be Hawaiian. It's right there in the words of the Kanikau. And to find out more about these words, we are so fortunate now to have more and more of these records made available to us in our Hawaii State Archives. And so, please make it worth your while to go and check these things out. Aloha.